A German shepherd's bark freezes a smiling driver and a little girl mid-step. The quiet street turns electric. What did Shadow sense inside that white van that every adult missed? The afternoon sun spread a warm glow over the quiet street outside Oakridge Elementary. Children spilling out, with backpacks bouncing and laughter ringing across the sidewalks. Parents waited near cars, chatting with one another while keeping half an eye on the crowd of children weaving past. It was the sort of ordinary moment that made the world feel safe, where danger seemed like something far away. Mia, with her long braid swinging down her back and her sneakers untied as always, spotted a white van idling by the curb. The driver leaned across the seat and smiled, his window sliding down with a soft hum. He waved as if he knew her, his voice smooth and practiced, saying he was here to pick her up. For a split second it made sense. Her father had been late before. Sometimes he sent friends or neighbors, but before Mia could take a step forward, Shadow moved. The German shepherd cut across the sidewalk like a streak of muscle and fur, planting himself firmly in front of Mia with his body low and tense, his teeth bared, ears pinned forward, and a growl rumbled deep in his chest. His bark shattered the calm of the street, sharp and fierce, not the kind of bark that called for play, but the kind that warned of danger. The van's engine gave a small roar as the driver shifted in his seat, his smile faltering for the briefest second before he covered it up again. Mia froze, one foot lifted as if unsure what to do, her small hand gripping the strap of her backpack. Parents nearby turned, some startled, others frowning, whispering that the dog was making a fuss over nothing. But Shadow did not move. His paws dug into the ground, claws scraping against the pavement as his eyes locked unblinking on the driver. The air around him seemed to hum with tension, every muscle braced, every breath short and sharp. Mia tried to step sideways, thinking maybe she could just go around him, but the shepherd snapped his head back at her, letting out another bark, this one directed at her, a command more than a warning. She stopped immediately, confusion mixing with the first threads of fear. The driver leaned farther out of the van, his voice still calm, still trying to sound friendly, saying her mother had sent him, that he was there to help. Yet his hand on the steering wheel twitched, and sweat glistened along his hairline even in the shade. Shadow's bark grew louder, angrier, echoing down the street, until even the children stopped laughing. One of the parents stepped closer, trying to soothe the dog, telling Mia it was fine. But then Shadow lunged forward, teeth snapping at the air, forcing the van driver to flinch back. The engine roared louder now, tires squealing against the curb as the vehicle jerked forward before speeding down the street. The sudden rush of motion sent papers flying and children screaming, teachers running to calm the chaos. In the middle of it all, Shadow stood tall, chest heaving, his amber eyes still fixed on the disappearing van. Mia pressed against his side, her heart pounding in her ears, and for the first time she realized the truth. Shadow had not been overreacting. He had been protecting her, and his bark had saved her from stepping into something far worse than she could imagine. The van crept closer to the sidewalk, its tires crunching against loose gravel, the window sliding down with a low hum. The driver leaned across the seat, his smile wide and too quick, showing teeth that didn't quite match the warmth in his words. In his hand was a bright red lollipop, twisted in its wrapper, which he waved toward Mia as if he were a friendly uncle arriving at just the right time. He called out her name, his voice smooth, telling her not to be afraid, saying her mother had sent him, that she was busy at work, and asked him to pick her up. His eyes flicked from Mia to the dog and back again, sharp and calculating under the surface of his grin. Mia shifted uncertainly, her small hand hovering near her backpack strap, her mind running in circles. She had never seen this man before, and her mother never sent strangers to get her, but the sound of her name and the candy made her hesitate for a breath. Before she could move, Shadow lunged forward, teeth bared, hackles standing like sharp ridges along his back. His growl cut through the air, low and dangerous, building into a furious bark that made heads snap toward him. The children nearby stopped laughing, their games forgotten as they turned to look, some clutching their parents' arms. The driver kept smiling, but the smile grew tighter, stretched too thin, his eyes narrowing with something closer to annoyance than patience. "It's all right," he said, louder now, his voice carrying across the street. "Her mom sent me. Here, sweetheart, I've got more candy in the van." His hand tapped the dashboard, and for just a moment, his sleeve slid back, revealing a scar across his wrist. Shadow's bark sharpened, echoing against the brick walls of the school. His paws clawed at the pavement as if he was daring the man to come closer. Mia froze, torn between the soft promise of sweets and the hard warning in Shadow's eyes. Parents began to murmur, one or two frowning and stepping forward, but the driver's act cracked under the weight of too many stares. The lollipop slipped from his fingers onto the seat, and he muttered something under his breath. Just then, a tall figure came striding down the sidewalk, boots striking hard against the pavement. Officer Daniel Hayes, Shadow's handler, had just left the school office when he heard the commotion. He saw the dog's stance, the van, the man leaning out with that forced grin, and his instincts lit up like a flare. Hayes raised a hand, calling out for Mia to stay where she was, his other hand moving toward his belt, where his badge gleamed in the fading light. The driver's smile vanished. His foot slammed on the gas, the van lurching forward so fast it nearly clipped the curb. Gravel sprayed across the road. Children screamed, and parents pulled them back as the white van tore down the street, swerving wildly before disappearing around the corner. Hayes broke into a run, but the vehicle was already gone, leaving behind the stink of burnt rubber and the echo of fear. Shadow stood stiff, ears forward, chest heaving, his gaze still locked on the place where the van had vanished. Mia clung to his fur, her small body trembling as tears filled her eyes. The crowd whispered, suspicion and unease settling over them like a cold shadow. Everyone realized the same thing at once, though no one wanted to say it aloud. That man hadn't come to help Mia. He had come to take her, and if not for Shadow's bark and fury, she might have been gone. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the Oakridge police station filled the silence, a low, steady buzz that only seemed to make the tension heavier. Sheriff Mason Cooper stood at the front of the room with a folder in his hands, his weathered face set in grim lines. Around the table sat a handful of deputies, their notepads open, pens tapping nervously against the paper. In the corner, Shadow moved back and forth, his nails clicking on the tiled floor, his head low but his ears twitching at every sound. His tail did not wag, his body was taut as a wire, and it was clear to everyone watching that the dog was unsettled in a way that went beyond ordinary training. Cooper opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. The glossy print showed a white van parked near a playground in another town, its license plate blurred by mud. He said in a voice that carried weight, vans matching this description had been connected to a string of child abductions across the county. His words cut through the room like a blade, and the deputies leaned closer, their faces tightening. 2 children had gone missing in the past month, one from a grocery store parking lot, the other from outside her own home, and neither had been found. The sheriff tapped the photograph with his thick finger, saying it was no coincidence that another van like this had shown up near Oakridge Elementary. Officer Daniel Hayes sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched as he thought of Mia standing so close to that stranger. He glanced at Shadow, who paused in his pacing to stare at the photo on the table as if he could sense what it meant. The dog gave a low whine, then turned sharply toward the door, muscles bunching beneath his coat. Hayes whispered his name, but Shadow ignored him, his nose twitching like he was catching a scent no one else could. One deputy muttered that it could still be a coincidence, maybe just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, but no one in the room believed it. The memory of the driver's wide smile and his sudden flight left no doubt in their minds. Sheriff Cooper's voice grew firm, saying they could not treat this lightly, not with children's lives at stake. He ordered extra patrols around schools and neighborhoods, told his deputies to check surveillance cameras, and promised that the FBI would be briefed before morning. In the corner, Shadow gave a sharp bark that made everyone jump. Hayes rose, resting a steady hand on the dog's back, but he could feel the tremor in the muscles beneath his fur. Shadow's amber eyes swept the room, unblinking, then returned to the door as though he was waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Cooper frowned at the animal, then looked at Hayes, saying quietly that sometimes dogs see more than humans ever will. The deputies began to file out, their voices low, whispers of fear filling the hallways as news of the abduction link spread. Parents waiting outside the station clutched their children closer, their questions spilling over, and the mood in town shifted with a sudden weight of dread. Inside the office, Hayes knelt beside Shadow, brushing his hand over the dog's scarred muzzle, whispering that they would find whoever was behind this. Shadow's ears flicked forward at the sound, his body still restless, his eyes still burning with a knowledge that no one else could name. The evening air settled heavy over Oakridge, the last glow of sunlight fading behind the rooftops. Mia's father, Thomas, stood on the porch with his arms crossed, watching as Officer Hayes tightened the leash around Shadow's collar. His face was pale and tired, the kind of weariness that came not just from the day, but from years of carrying grief. When he thanked Hayes, his voice carried a tremor he tried to hide, saying the officer had saved his daughter's life today, but the words hung in the air unfinished, because both of them knew it wasn't over. Danger had brushed too close, and shadows had a way of returning. Hayes told him patrol cars would sweep through the neighborhood more often, that deputies were keeping an eye out for the van. He spoke with calm authority, but Thomas could see the stiffness in his jaw, the way his eyes shifted toward the street as if expecting headlights to appear at any moment. When Hayes left, Shadow did not follow him. Instead, the dog settled at the top of the porch steps, his chest broad and steady, his gaze fixed outward like a sentinel who had claimed this ground as his own. Inside, Mia curled on the couch with a blanket pulled to her chin, her wide eyes fixed on the television but not really seeing it. Thomas sat beside her, trying to coax a smile with soft words, telling her she was safe now, that no one could get her here. But she whispered that the man knew her name, that he had smiled at her like he already belonged in her life. Her father's hand tightened on her shoulder as he swallowed hard, the weight of memory pressing against him. He remembered another smile, another night when a knock at the door had ended with his wife gone forever. The wound of that loss never healed, and now it threatened to open all over again. Outside, Shadow shifted with every passing sound, his ears flicking at the rustle of leaves, the scrape of a bicycle down the street, the distant bark of another dog. He did not relax, not even when the porch light clicked on. His body stayed tense, his breathing slow and deliberate, as though he had taken on the duty of guarding the girl who had nearly been stolen. Neighbors walking by glanced at him, whispering to one another about the shepherd that never seemed to blink, the one that growled at strangers and watched with eyes too sharp to be ordinary. Some said he was just well-trained, others wondered if he knew something the rest of them didn't. As the night deepened, Thomas checked the locks twice, then 3 times, pacing the house while Mia drifted into uneasy sleep. From the porch came the steady sound of Shadow's claws against the wooden boards, a quiet scrape whenever he shifted his weight. The dog never lay fully down, only crouched low, eyes glowing faint in the porch light, a living wall between the house and whatever waited beyond. Thomas stood at the window and watched him, his heart aching with both gratitude and fear. He whispered into the silence that he could not lose his daughter, not after everything already stolen from them. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound, as if he understood, and his body stilled, a promise carved into fur and muscle. The danger was not gone, but as long as he stood watch, it would not pass unnoticed again. The night was quiet in Oakridge, the kind of quiet that sinks deep into the walls of a house and makes every sound sharper. Mia was asleep upstairs, her small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, a nightlight casting soft shapes across her room. Her father sat at the kitchen table with a half-finished cup of coffee, his head heavy in his hands, the weight of worry pressing down like it always did when darkness fell. Outside on the porch, Shadow lay curled on an old blanket, his body stretched but his ears never at rest. He had been dozing lightly, waiting more than sleeping, when the low growl began in his throat. His head lifted sharply, eyes flashing toward the street. Tires rolled over gravel with a slow crunch, heavy but cautious, the sound of a vehicle trying not to be noticed. Within seconds, Shadow was on his feet, his body rigid, fur bristling along his back. His bark tore through the silence, deep and furious, a sound that rattled the windows and woke Thomas from his chair. He stumbled to the front door, heart hammering, pulling it open just as Shadow lunged off the porch. The German shepherd's claws scraped the pavement, his bark relentless, aimed at the shadowy outline of a white van idling at the curb with its headlights off. For one chilling moment, the van sat still, the shape of its frame looming like a ghost at the edge of the street. Thomas shouted, his voice raw, while Shadow advanced another step, hackles high, his body blocking the yard as if daring the van to come closer. Then, without warning, the engine roared, and the van jerked forward, tires spitting gravel. Its lights stayed dark as it tore down the road, vanishing around the corner before Thomas could even catch the plate. His hand shook as he reached for the phone, but Shadow didn't stop, barking and growling, his eyes now turned toward the line of trees beyond the street. Moments later, Officer Hayes pulled up, called from his own home, just blocks away by Thomas's frantic voice. He leapt from his car with his sidearm drawn, scanning the street. But by the time he reached the spot where the van had been, there was nothing but the smell of exhaust and the faint skid marks curling toward the woods. Shadow strained against his collar, his claws digging lines into the pavement, his nose flaring as he pulled toward the trees, every muscle alive with certainty. Hayes knelt to steady him, feeling the tremor of energy pulsing through the dog's frame, realizing that Shadow wasn't barking at nothing. The van had come and gone, but its trail still lingered, and Shadow wanted to follow. Thomas stood on the porch, pale and shaking, Mia's voice calling faintly from the upstairs window, asking what was wrong. He told her nothing, but his eyes betrayed the truth, filled with the knowledge that the danger hadn't passed them by. It had come back to circle closer. Shadow barked once more into the night, his teeth bared, his body aimed at the woods like an arrow. Hayes followed his gaze, a knot forming in his chest. The van was gone, but not far enough, and the dog knew it better than anyone. The woods behind Oakridge spread out in twisting paths, the kind that carried the smell of damp leaves and old earth. The night was heavy, clouds blotting out the stars, and the only sound was the steady rustle of Shadow pushing forward through the undergrowth. Hayes followed close behind, his flashlight cutting narrow beams of light across the trail, though it was the dog who truly led the way. Shadow's nose was low to the ground, his breath sharp, each inhale pulling him deeper into the scent he had locked onto. It was more than just the faint stench of exhaust that clung to the branches. It was something sharper, an oily tang of engine grease, and something else, a chemical sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. Hayes muttered softly, trying to steady his own nerves, but Shadow gave no sign of slowing. His body was tense but certain, every step pushing them farther from the safety of the street and deeper into the shadows of the trees. The officer could feel the weight of the night pressing in, the silence so complete it seemed to watch them. Then Shadow stopped, his ears pivoting, his nose pressed hard into the damp soil beside a patch of broken twigs. He pawed at the ground, pulling up a crumpled black glove, half buried in mud. Hayes crouched down, pulling a cloth from his pocket to lift it. The glove was torn at the wrist, and even before he held it close, the sharp sting of chemicals hit his nose. It burned faintly, unmistakable, the acrid scent of chloroform clinging to the fabric. His chest tightened, not just with anger, but with the sudden realization of what it meant. This wasn't the tool of a man acting alone, not a desperate drifter looking for a quick chance. This was preparation, organized and planned. The kind of thing he had only seen in files passed between departments. Shadow growled low, pacing in a tight circle, his amber eyes reflecting the light from Hayes's beam. The dog nosed the glove again, then lifted his head toward the deeper woods, his whole body straining as if he could still feel the trail winding forward. Hayes's mind raced, pieces falling together faster than he wanted. Reports from nearby counties, missing children with no trace, families left shattered and searching. The FBI had been chasing whispers of a trafficking ring that used vans like ghosts, appearing and disappearing, snatching kids without leaving evidence behind. And now here it was, right at his doorstep, bleeding into Oakridge like poison. Hayes stood, his grip tightening on the glove. His voice was low when he spoke, almost to himself, saying that this was bigger than any of them had thought. Shadow pressed against his leg, his body trembling with energy, urging him onward. For a moment Hayes stared into the dark woods, the branches swaying slightly in the breeze, the night stretching out like a maze without end. He knew they couldn't chase it all down tonight, not without backup, not without risking everything. But he also knew one thing with certainty. The van, the glove, the smell of chloroform, it all meant Oakridge wasn't dealing with a lone predator. They were standing at the edge of something far more dangerous, and Shadow had dragged the truth out of the dark. The morning at Oakridge Elementary was full of the usual sounds: sneakers squeaking across polished floors, lockers slamming, teachers calling out greetings to their classes. Children laughed and shouted in the hallways, their voices bouncing like echoes of safety. Yet for Mia, the noise felt distant, muffled, as though the world had shifted since the day the white van first appeared. She sat at her desk, with her pencil scratching faintly across a torn piece of notebook paper, her small hand shaking as she wrote. She didn't want to say it aloud, she didn't want anyone to overhear, but she knew she had to tell someone who would believe her. By the time Officer Hayes stepped into the hall to check in on the school resource officer, Mia was waiting near the doorway. Her face was pale, her braid loose, her eyes darting nervously toward the playground beyond the window. When he passed by, she tugged lightly at his sleeve, her movements quick and uncertain. She slipped the folded note into his hand without a word, then scurried back to her seat as though nothing had happened. Hayes frowned, unfolding the paper as he walked down the hall. The handwriting was uneven, the letters pressed hard into the page as if fear itself had guided her pencil. The message was simple but chilling. I saw the van again. It was parked by the fence at recess. I know the man's face. I saw him before, at Mom's funeral. Hayes stopped in his tracks, the words burning into his mind. A cold chill traced down his spine as he read them again, slower this time, hoping he had misunderstood. But the message didn't change. The driver wasn't just a stranger circling schools, he was someone connected to Mia's life, someone close enough to have been at one of the most private and painful days her family had endured. Shadow, sitting at Hayes's side as always, shifted suddenly. His ears twitched, his head turning toward the playground, with a low rumble deep in his chest. Hayes clenched the paper tighter, his eyes following the dog's stare. Beyond the glass, the chain link fence stood still, children climbing and swinging, teachers chatting in groups. Nothing looked out of place, yet the unease crawled across Hayes's skin. He trusted Shadow's instincts more than his own eyes, and the dog's body was taut, ready, as though he too could feel the weight of that note. Hayes folded the paper quickly, sliding it into his pocket before returning to Mia's classroom. She avoided his gaze, her head bent over her book, but he crouched near her desk and whispered that she had done the right thing. She gave the smallest nod, her lips pressed tight, her fingers clenched on her pencil until her knuckles were white. Walking back down the hall, Hayes felt the walls closing in. A man bold enough to return after being chased off, a man who had stood near Mia and her grieving family years ago, meant this was no coincidence. Shadow's low growl at his side was steady now, his amber eyes watching the window. Hayes knew they were not just dealing with a predator anymore. They were facing someone who had already marked Mia's life, long before the van appeared. And that truth made the air around him feel colder than the grave. The night was damp and cool, the kind of night where every sound carried farther than it should. Patrol cars lined the far end of the street with their lights dimmed, radios low, deputies waiting in silence as if the entire town was holding its breath. The plan was simple. Let the van circle again, let it believe the neighborhood was asleep, and then close in. Sheriff Mason Cooper stood near the edge of the block with a pair of binoculars in his hands, his face grim and unreadable. Beside him, Officer Hayes crouched low, one hand gripping Shadow's collar. The dog strained forward, muscles tense, ears pinned on the distant hum of an engine drifting closer. The white van rolled into view, its headlights off, its shadow long against the houses. It crept past the playground, then slowed, pausing as though waiting for some unseen signal. Shadow growled low in his throat, his body pulling against Hayes's grip. Hayes whispered firmly for him to stay, but the dog's amber eyes never left the van. He seemed to know this was more than routine, that something darker rode in that vehicle. The van circled once, then again, before turning onto a narrow road at the end of town, a dead-end street where old houses sagged and weeds grew tall against leaning fences. Cooper gave the signal, and the squad cars began to move in, engines revving softly as they closed the trap. Tires crunched over gravel, doors swung open, and deputies fanned out with weapons drawn. The van sat motionless, its windows dark, no sign of movement inside. Hayes advanced carefully, Shadow pulling harder now, barking once, sharp and loud. The sound echoed off the empty houses, cutting through the quiet. Deputies flinched, then pressed forward. Hayes reached the driver's side, yanking the door open, but the seat was empty. The back doors were locked tight. Cooper muttered under his breath, cursing, and ordered the locks forced. With a crack of metal and a heavy tug, the doors swung wide. The interior was stripped bare. No seats, no windows, just a hollow shell that smelled of oil and sweat. Shadow didn't wait for permission. He lunged to the rear bumper, his claws scraping against the metal, his nose pressed against the corner seam. He barked again, frantic this time, pawing and digging as if he could tear the van apart himself. Hayes dropped to his knees, shining his flashlight where the dog's claws raked. At first it looked like nothing, just rust and old paint, but then he saw the faint outline of a false panel. One of the deputies grabbed a crowbar and pried it open with a groan of metal. Behind the panel was a narrow compartment, smeared with dark stains that glistened under the light. The smell hit them first, metallic and sour, unmistakable. Cooper's jaw tightened as he leaned closer, his face pale. Inside were scraps of cloth, a child's hair ribbon, and the undeniable streaks of blood across the metal walls. A heavy silence fell over the officers, broken only by Shadow's steady growl. Hayes felt his stomach twist, his grip tightening on the leash. This wasn't just a chase anymore. The van was more than a vehicle. It was a trap in motion, part of something far larger, and Shadow had ripped away the mask. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, each of them realizing what they had just stepped into. Oakridge was no longer safe ground, and the enemy had already been here. The name came back from the lab late the next afternoon, written in neat black ink across a folder that Sheriff Cooper slid onto the table. The van had been traced through a string of shell registrations, fake addresses, and old records, but in the end, one name surfaced through the layers: Raymond Blackwell. On paper, he was the last man anyone in Oakridge would suspect. He was a wealthy businessman, a smiling figure in the newspaper, a man who shook hands at fundraisers and cut ribbons at youth centers. His foundation sponsored after-school programs. His face appeared on glossy flyers about mentorship and opportunity, and people called him generous. Yet the room fell quiet when the sheriff read his name, because the dog sitting in the corner lifted his head and let out a growl so low It made the windows hum. Shadow's reaction was not casual. His ears flattened, his teeth bared, and his whole body pressed forward as if the sound of that name alone was enough to trigger recognition. Hayes tried to calm him, but the shepherd's amber eyes burned. His gaze locked on the folder like he knew the man written inside had touched darkness. Hayes frowned, his hand resting on Shadow's back, the unease in his chest spreading faster than he could explain. 2 days later, Blackwell himself stood at the center of a press event in the Oakridge Community Hall. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and parents shook his hand as he announced a new scholarship program. His voice carried across the room, warm and polished. The kind of voice that convinced people he was safe. Hayes stood near the back with Shadow on a short leash, part of the quiet security detail assigned to watch the event. The dog was calm at first, his tail low, his eyes scanning the crowd, but the moment Blackwell stepped off the stage to mingle, Shadow stiffened. The German shepherd's head snapped around, his nostrils flaring, his body locking in place like a hunter catching a scent. Hayes felt the leash go taut in his hand, the muscles under Shadow's fur trembling with rage. Then came the bark, sharp and furious, so loud it cut through the speeches and startled the crowd into silence. People gasped, pulling back, eyes widening as Shadow lunged, snarling, his teeth flashing toward the man in the tailored suit. Blackwell froze, his smile faltering for the first time in public memory. Hayes dragged Shadow back with every ounce of strength, his voice low and firm, but the dog's fury did not ease. His hackles were up, his growls relentless, his entire body telling the truth no one wanted to hear. The crowd whispered, confused, unsettled, while Blackwell forced his smile to return, waving lightly as if to dismiss the commotion. But Hayes's mind was no longer on the crowd. It was on the memory that had surfaced the moment he saw Blackwell's face. Mia's mother, the investigative reporter who had died so suddenly, her case left in silence. Hayes remembered her funeral, the line of mourners moving past, the man in the suit standing too close, offering condolences with a practiced face. It had been Raymond Blackwell. He had worked with her once, sponsored one of her community projects, smiled for photos beside her while she wrote about corruption, and now Shadow was telling him what no file ever could. This man wasn't just a benefactor. He was the ghost behind the wheel, and his mask was finally beginning to slip. The rain came steady that night, a soft tapping against the windows of Hayes's truck as he pulled up to the small house Mia's family had left locked since her mother's death. The porch sagged a little with age, the paint on the door had begun to peel, and the air inside smelled faintly of dust and paper when Hayes pushed it open. He had been here once before, long ago, when Mia's mother had still been alive, a determined journalist with sharp eyes and a voice that carried weight. Now the house felt like a shell, quiet and waiting, the kind of place where secrets linger in corners. Shadow padded inside, without hesitation, his claws clicking softly against the wooden floor, his nose lifted as if he already knew what they had come to find. Hayes followed him through the narrow hallway, his flashlight beam brushing over framed photos, a desk stacked with unopened mail, and the worn carpet where Mia once played with her toys. The dog paused outside the study door, his body stiff, his tail low, and then pushed his head against it until it opened with a creak. Inside the air was heavier, thick with the smell of ink and dust. Papers still covered the desk, notebooks filled with hurried writing, articles left half finished. Shadow paced the room in a tight circle, then stopped near the corner by the window. He sniffed the floorboards hard, pawing at the wood until his nails scraped. Hayes knelt beside him, brushing the dust away, and noticed the faint outline of a board cut smaller than the rest. With careful effort, he pried it up, the wood lifting free with a groan that echoed in the silence. Beneath was a shallow space lined with plastic, and inside lay a small flash drive, its casing plain except for 2 words scratched into the surface. Van Project. Hayes stared at it for a long moment, his chest tightening, before slipping it into his pocket. He whispered to Shadow that they had found something worth guarding. something her mother had hidden with purpose. Back at the station, under the sterile light of the evidence lab, he slid the drive into a secure computer. Folders bloomed across the screen, filled with documents, financial transfers, and scanned photos. Hayes leaned closer, scrolling through page after page, his pulse pounding harder with each file. There were bank records showing Blackwell's foundation moving money through shell accounts, property deeds tied to abandoned warehouses near state borders, lists of children, names, and ages, each marked with a final note: missing. The files spanned 3 states, linking every piece of the puzzle that had haunted investigators for months. Hayes's stomach turned as the truth settled over him. Mia's mother had been on the trail of the ring long before anyone else, gathering evidence quietly, hiding it when she realized she had been discovered. Shadow lay at his side, his body still but his eyes never leaving the screen, as though he too understood the weight of what they had uncovered. Hayes whispered into the empty room that she hadn't died by chance. She had been silenced, stopped before she could bring this to light. Now the evidence she left behind was breathing again, and with it came the promise that the man behind the wheel would not escape. The night carried the sharp chill of autumn, the streets slick with rain that shimmered beneath the faint glow of street lamps. Hayes had known this moment was coming. The second Blackwell realized the walls were closing in. The man's calm smile had cracked when confronted with the files pulled from the flash drive, his polished voice stumbling for once as agents laid out the evidence piece by piece. Then, without warning, he bolted. Chairs clattered to the floor, papers scattered like startled birds, and by the time Hayes reached the door, Blackwell was already behind the wheel of a waiting van. The engine roared to life, tires shrieking as the vehicle lunged into the night. Shadow was faster. He tore past Hayes, his paws hammering the pavement, his bark splitting the darkness like a signal flare. The van swerved wildly down the street, headlights bouncing off windows, but the dog's stride did not falter. Hayes sprinted after them, his breath burning, the voices of FBI agents shouting commands fading behind him. All he could see was Shadow, chasing the white blur like it was prey that could not be allowed to escape. Blackwell pressed the van harder, the wheels throwing water high into the air. But when he rounded the bend near the old mill road, Shadow made his move. With a burst of power, he leapt, his body slamming onto the hood, claws screeching across metal. The windshield exploded in a spiderweb of cracks. As the shepherd's weight landed heavy, his amber eyes locked on the man behind the wheel. Blackwell shouted, jerking the wheel back and forth, but Shadow held firm, his teeth bared, his growl vibrating through the glass. The van veered, clipping a lamppost, sparks bursting across the night. Hayes's heart lurched as he chased closer, his hand reaching for his sidearm. But Shadow gave no ground. He lunged at the windshield, his jaws closing around the edge of shattered glass, tearing it free until Blackwell was exposed. The man raised an arm to shield himself, his other hand fumbling for the pistol at his side. But Shadow struck first. His jaws clamped onto Blackwell's forearm, the weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. The van skidded sideways, metal screaming, before it slammed to a halt against a guardrail. Agents swarmed seconds later, their red and blue lights flooding the street with color, their voices cutting through the night. Hayes reached the driver's side just as Shadow tore himself free from the man's arm, dropping back to the pavement with a heavy thud. Blackwell groaned, clutching the wound, his eyes wide not with pain, but with the realization that he had finally been cornered. Hayes pulled him from the seat, shoving him into waiting hands, his voice steady as he told the agents to cuff him tight. He glanced at Shadow, who stood panting, sides heaving, paws bleeding from glass, but his eyes burned bright, unbroken. The shepherd gave one last bark, short and sharp, the sound of triumph cutting through the chaos. For months the man had hidden behind wealth and reputation, but now his mask was gone. The truth was pinned beneath flashing lights, and the hero, who had chased it into the open, stood steady at the center of the storm. The storm had passed, but the weight of it lingered in Oakridge. Streets that only days ago had been quiet and safe now carried the memory of sirens and flashing lights. The town buzzed with whispers of the man they thought they knew, Raymond Blackwell, exposed as the one behind the van, and the children who had vanished. For families who had waited in silence, there was grief and relief woven together. But through it all, one name rose again and again: Shadow. In the hospital waiting room, Mia sat curled against her father's side, her arms wrapped tightly around the German shepherd's neck. Shadow bore the marks of the night, scratches across his muzzle, bandages wrapped around his paws, but he sat tall and steady, his chest rising with calm breaths. Mia pressed her face into his fur, whispering that he was her guardian angel, that he had saved her again and again, and she would never let him go. The dog shifted slightly, leaning into her small frame, as if to remind her that his place was beside her and always would be. News crews filled the town square, their cameras flashing, their voices carrying across the airwaves about the hero dog who had brought down a trafficking ring. Headlines called him a miracle, a soldier, a savior, and people drove from neighboring counties just to leave flowers, treats, or cards at the steps of the police station. Children drew pictures of him with wings and capes, their parents wiping tears as they handed them to officers. For once the town, bruised by fear, had something pure to hold on to. A week later, under the wide blue sky of a Saturday morning, the sheriff's department gathered in front of the courthouse. Folding chairs lined the lawn, a small crowd pressed together to witness the ceremony. Hayes stood tall in his uniform, Shadow at his side, the sun glinting off the dog's coat. Sheriff Cooper stepped forward with a velvet box in his hands, his voice steady as he spoke of bravery that could not be measured, of instincts that saved lives when men hesitated. He said the department owed more than thanks to the animal who had stood between innocence and evil. Mia squeezed her father's hand as the sheriff clipped the medal onto Shadow's collar, the silver gleaming against the worn leather strap. The crowd rose in applause, cheers breaking through tears, and Shadow stood motionless, his ears forward, as if he understood the weight of the moment. Hayes knelt beside him, his voice low so only the dog could hear. "You saw what no one else could," he whispered, his hand resting against the scarred muzzle. For a heartbeat the air held still, then Shadow lifted his head and barked once, sharp and clear, a sound that rang through the crowd like a bell. It was not noise, it was a declaration, the sound of truth laid bare. Mia laughed through her tears, hugging him tighter, calling him her hero, her angel. The town would never forget what he had done, but for her and for Hayes, the meaning ran deeper. He was not just the dog who caught a criminal. He was the reason they could walk forward into tomorrow, stronger, safer, carrying the sound of justice in his bark. Thank you for watching this video of a dog's devotion. If you like this story, show your support with a like. And join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.